one about perceptual categories or perceptual objects, how they emerge from neural processing and how they are represented by neural neural populations. And then I hope I'll have time to discuss the more challenging, in my view, question about structures beyond categories, but knowledge structures, relations, episodic memory, semantics, and so on. So, first of all, what do I mean by distributed representation or neural representation in general? So, what I think that most of computational neuroscience or systems neuroscience have in mind the following models. So, what you see in the left is a space, three-dimensional space, but imagine 100 or 1,000 or million-dimensional space, depending on what part of the brain you are looking at. And the axes are the level of activity, the instantaneous response in terms of number of spikes in a given window of time of different neurons, so neuron 1, neuron 2, neuron 3, neuron n, and so on. So this is what we call the neural state space, which means that every point, like in the middle, every point in that space basically represents a possible state of the network. So I'll call it population vector. So and it's distributed because typically that vector engage or represent the activity of many neurons. So maybe some of them will be kind of at the zero, but otherwise all neurons participate in this vector. So the representations of the vector is instantaneous, so to speak, state of a given network, which simply as a vector encodes the activity of this time of neuron 1, neuron 2, neuron 3, up to neuron n. Now you can, of course, describe in this metaphor, mathematical metaphor, the dynamics, or dynamics, the evolution of time of the responses of that particular population of neurons will be simply geometrically speaking, will be kind of a trajectory in this state space. For now, I'll come back to trajectories, but for now I'm thinking about a single time window and not the dynamics of evolution of that representation. So, what do we mean by representation? So these are just the possible states of the network. When I'm saying that this is a representation, I mean that those vectors, those possible different points, arise from a response of the network to a particular stimulus. So, for instance, if it's a dog, if a stimulus, visual stimulus, a dog appears in the visual field, so in some cortical area, so to speak, there will be a response vector, population vector response to that particular stimulus. So neuron 1 will respond in this amount, neuron 2, neuron n, and so on. And for a different stimulus, there will be another vector, and so on. So if indeed these vectors are selective or are modulated by the stimuli, so we'll say this is a representation of the ensemble of this of this stimuli. So it's a very simple notion, not much philosophy beyond that. Okay, so imagine we have some network that respond to various stimuli in this way. What can we say about computation? What is it good for? So now we have a notion and another mathematical constant, and this is how do we decode information about the stimulus by just viewing the response of this population vector, or more precisely how downstream circuits of this population can, using the activity of these neurons, can infer about the external world, or about the stimuli that generated that. So more concretely, we think very typically about kind of a classification task. So we say, imagine we want to to be able to classify, for instance, this stimuli as positive and this stimuli as negative. So we imagine that there is a downstream to this population of neurons. There will be an output neuron connected to this population. So this will be input of this population of neurons to an output unit, and that output unit is connected with certain synaptic weights called W, And if you think about W, put it back into this state space, you can see that this W basically, if it's appropriately learned, will classify those inputs as plus because they project on this W positive projection, and this stimuli have negative projections, then they will be classified as minus. You can think about geometrically as kind of drawing a hyperplane in this state space, and every population vector above the hyperplane will be classified by this particular set of output as plus and others as minus. So I want to emphasize that this classification, which I'm talking about, is kind of transient. The response features are the stable representation. What do we do with it? It depends on the day-to-day task, right? So at one day I would like to decode this stimuli as plus and this will a minus. Maybe next day I would like to encode this as pluses and this as minus. Then I'll have to rewire those synaptic weights so that the plane will go in this direction, not in this direction, and so on. So there is a representation of the stimuli, and this representation should enable all kinds of computations or readouts or decoding of that stimuli. So that's nice. However, now comes the notion of a category or notion of an object, and the notion of an object, particularly from this geometric framework, is can be thought about object manifold. What do I mean by that? So now we have to think about a category. So not individual dog, but imagine that the same dog but appears in different pose, different location, and so on and so forth. So then there will be again each one of these particular physical instantiation of the dog will just generate a different vector, different population vector. And similarly for cat and so on and so forth. Now, the collection of all possible population vectors responding to all possible instantiation of a dog, we'll call them manifolds. So this collection of states represent in this geometric fashion the object or the category dog versus the category cat, and house, and a car, and so on and so forth. So now the problem of using that representation to make some computation downstream systems is more complicated, because now you can see that those manifolds extend in this state space, and it's much harder to kind of find a hyperplane or weight vector in downstream circuits to make the proper classification of, let's say, this one should be +1. So now it's not two points, but the whole manifold of state should be +1, or manifold of state should be +1, and here -1 and -1 and so on. So when we talk about perceptually or invariant computation or perceptual invariance, we actually talk about whether, to what extent we can actually compute or make a computation which is relying on the label, on the category of those of each individual states, to make a decision. Let's say this is a cat, or I like this. This is a house. I like the house. I like the cat and the dog and the cat. I don't like those. Or different computations. Are all kinds of computations that I can think of that I would like to do, which rely only on the label of the category, but on identity of the category rather than their physical instantiation. So this is the classical problem: how the brain manages to enable kind of invariant computation. That's basically how, in other words, how the brain creates categories or objects or concepts and so on and so forth. So in terms of vision, we can describe this question in terms of the visual hierarchy, but particularly the ventral stream. So we have pixel layer, the image itself. We just will call the retina as the pixel layer. Then we have the cortex, various stages, and then finally the IT cortex. So for many years, the question was two questions. First of all, computationally, how the brain manages to take the patterns of activation of lights on the eye and generates a concept of a house and so on. And the other question, the complementary question is, why do we need all these stages of processing in the visual hierarchy and other hierarchies as well? So there was a kind of a qualitative notion that were raised as hypotheses by several researchers, which said that basically the hierarchy, the reason for why you have hierarchy, is to solve this perceptual invariance problem. That's precisely the reason why we need this hierarchy. And the idea is that think about the neural responses of two different people, again, because they can come in a variety of poses and locations and expressions and so on. So each one of them is represented as a manifold, complicated, crumpled, nonlinear manifold in the let's say on the eye, in the retina, and the other guy, Joe, or whatever I don't see here, is a different manifold, and it's virtually impossible to separate them at this level. But then somehow those stages reformat the same data and finally untangle them. So untangling means that now all this manifold is nicely separated, and you can now draw a hyperplane separating them. So important point behind this hypothesis is that the empirical fact that if you look at the responses of neurons in IT cortex, they are not themselves invariant. So there is no invariant representation, at least not in the visual hierarchy. In other words, if you take an object, and we know that neurons in IT cortex like object or like faces and so on and so forth, but if you vary the orientation of the object and other features, or the pose of the humans, and so on and so forth, neurons will be selective to that, will modulate their responses. So there is no invariant representation. So the idea is that nevertheless, as long as those manifolds are nicely separated, it's good enough to make invariant computation, to draw hyperplanes separating those manifolds. Okay, so this is a nice idea, but is it real? Is it something which is a story? But can it basically be the case that, or what is needed to actually do it? Do we need something more fancier than top-down, than lateral connection, than priors and predictive coding and whatever you want? So this was an open question, but the revolution in deep networks told us an important lesson about that, I think. And this is that, as you all know, it started in 2012, the famous ImageNet competition. So the competition the database consisted of about 1 million images, organized in about 1,000 or more categories. So each category has about 1,000 images. And you can look here at kind of samples of these images of different categories. You see that they are quite complex. They are occluded. There are many other things. Background is rich. They come in different form, different shapes, different colors, and so on. So it's highly non-trivial task to actually make a computation to say this is a mug, or this is hat and mug and not dog and cats, and so on and so forth. So this is the ImageNet competition. And so here are the examples of easy and hard images. This was a surprising result was, in this competition in 2012, is that a deep network, this in case the Alexnet, called Alexnet, so basically a series of feed-forward stages without any other fancy things, but the only thing is that they actually learned by recycling many times the many examples to actually perform the task, in the sense that after all these stages, there is now at the end, there is downstream nodes that say this is a cat, this is a hat, this is a dog, this is a house, and so on, with surprising level of accuracy. Okay, and there are many networks that since then have been doing that. I will skip that. And here's the kind of the results, the chronological results. So this is attempt to do the shallow networks. You see there is a 28% of of error, 25% of error, and so on. Chance, by the way, is almost 95% of error, right? Because of 1,000 categories and so on. So this is not bad, 28% of error, but it's not something that you want to live with or to use as your visual system. But now in 2012, when we talked about Alexnet with 8 deep layers, now there is substantial drop in the performance, in the error, and since then it has been going a lot deeper in architecture and better in performance. And 2015, basically, it was superior to human performance. So that's amazing. And that's basically, I would say, the rest is history. Changed the world in many ways, and all what we talk about AI and machine learning and all this stuff is basically a revolution that started with the realization that these deep networks can solve such a complex perceptual task. All right, so then we went back to, so we means Dan Lee and Uri Cohen, and Uri Cohen is a student at the Hebrew University, Dan Lee is at Stanford, is at Samsung and Cornell, and Suyung is at Columbia. We took back the idea of untangling manifolds and asked whether this is what actually happens. Now, we don't know about the brain, there are very little data. So, but we can say, well, now we have a fake brain, right? We can take those deep networks after they were trained, think about it at the visual hierarchy, and see whether this is what they do, whether they actually untangle the manifold to enable to do this kind of task. And so, what we ask is, what are really can we conceptualize the transformation of the geometry? When we say untangling, what does it mean? How the geometry of those manifolds change as you go from one stage to another. Each stage, think about it as basically creating a manifold of those objects, and now these manifolds are going to change from one stage to another. Can we see really a progression of changes that make them at the end to be something that is we can separate them easily, and how can, whether this is actually what happens. So to make the story short and brief and not technical, we have a definition, a computational definition of separability of manifold or objects. Basically, it's how many objects I can separate by some arbitrary computation. Suppose I want to say I want to separate animals from non-animals, or inanimate from animate, or all animals that live in the north part of Israel versus all animals that live in the south part. Some kind of arbitrary classification, but it's based on the object, on the identity of the object participating in it. So how many of those I can do in a given representation, a given population of neurons. The first result is, which was very important, I think, is profound results, at least practically, for understanding visual cortex and other areas of cortex, is that it's extensive, that this number of manifold, the maximum number of manifold that I can handle in a computation in invariant fashion is proportional to the number of neurons, to the size of this layer, which practically mean I don't have to measure the 100 or 50 or whatever million neurons in IT cortex in order to say, to get an idea about its computational power in terms of object recognition. It's enough to actually measure about 1,000 neurons and then scale it up, and that seemed to work. So this is why we have this notion of capacity of separating manifolds in a computation as the number of manifolds per number of neurons. Secondly is that the capacity is a function, a strong function of the geometry of the manifold, not surprising. But primarily two notions is radius of the overall size of the manifolds and the dimensionality of the manifold, which is, how many directions it is spread. And finally, the theory said that basically there is a simple rule. Once you know how to compute the radius and dimensionality of the manifold, then if this product is less than 1, then you are in good shape. You are in IT hopefully cortex, and if it's much bigger one, you are close to the periphery, maybe to the retina. That's a prediction, that's the hypothesis. That's what comes out of the theory. Now, we applied the theory to a variety of deep networks, and indeed, this seems to hold. So here is the capacity to separate manifolds as a function of the layers of the network. This after training the network. So this is like in mature IT cortex, and this is how the capacity is increasing. So there is a very substantial increase in the capacity of separating manifolds, not surprisingly, from the pixel layer to the top layers. But what is consistent with the theory that there is a very systematic and very substantial reduction in the dimensionality of the manifolds and in the radius of the manifolds, and there are many interesting features of those changes that we learned from this analysis, but I won't have time to talk about that. Okay, so now there is another issue. So when we discuss this issue with colleagues and in the literature, there is a notion that perhaps there is something missing from this story, which is it's not about what the cortex is for. It's not about to be able to do kind of high capacity arbitrary computations on concepts, but actually to learn new concepts. Because all that we've done here is after the network has seen and trained over many, many images and built those representations, how good these representations here. So about learning new categories. So this is actually an interesting and hot topic today in cognitive science, in machine learning. It's called the few-shot category learning, and advertised and popularized and emphasized by Josh Tenenbaum and his group and others. And basically saying, okay, so humans you can show human a new object or a new items from a new language, whatever, never seen it before. You just show 4 instances, and then we can generalize to other instances without any problem. And on machines are not so. You have to show many, many examples and so on and so forth until they form a concept of an object and so on. So we went back and asked, this is work with Ben Sorcher and Yoav Shalit, whether this is indeed the case, whether Tenenbaum is right that you need prior Bayesian learning and so on to solve this few-shot learning, or perhaps actually feed-forward deep networks, and presumably is very minimal structure in the cortex, actually is possible to do the job. So what we did, we have a theory, I'll forget it, okay. We basically did the same type of an experiment, taking a trained network and now presented examples of concepts or objects or categories that the network has not seen before, like a shirt or, I don't know, animals of various sort, and so on and so forth. Those objects and those categories were not present in the way that the networks have been trained. And now the question is, okay, I taken one image of a shirt, another image of a certain animal. I show the network, and now can the network learn just from 2 examples any other arbitrary instances of these 2 categories? And the answer is surprisingly yes. And this is, again, examples. This is the generalization error on the y-axis. You can see many pairs of this new concept have very low generalization errors, so very nice generalization capacity. And moreover, they are organized here. So many different pairs. So this is why there are many points here. They're organized as a function of, again, a geometry, which is how much they're separated in a very specific geometric sense. And you can see that there is a very tight relation between the generalization and this effective radius or separation, and the dashed line is the prediction of the theory. So it fits perfectly with theory. And furthermore, you can do it on the pixel layer, based to do this task, looking at the pixel layer, and you see that's a very substantial deterioration of the performance. Many are close to chance. So basically, that's one way to think about what IT cortex is doing better than than the input layer. So I want now to briefly discuss with you, I think, an even stronger challenge. So basically, the conclusion of this is that in order to perform computation of categories, you don't need grandmother cell or some neurons that are, every time you show a dog, whatever it is, it has the same firing pattern and so on. It's enough that those manifold of states corresponding to object are compact enough in dimension, in radius, that's sufficient for whatever you need for generalization, for high capacity computation, and so on. What about more higher level data structures? For instance, temporal sequences or episodic memory or cognitive maps. So here's an example of a spatial cognitive map. So there is a lot of neuroscience and cognitive science about space representation. Population of neurons respond to a particular location of the animal in the space. But cognitive maps are more than that, are associations between different objects and position in space. And animals and humans will not have hard time to form these associations in multiple environments and so on and so forth. So episodic memory is again a collection of associations between different items, temporal sequences, temporal association, language, sentences, and semantic structures. Neuroscience, I would say, almost had nothing to say about it. Unfortunately, I think most of neuroscience, computational and experimental, have very little to say simply because we don't have good models of how the brain might represent those. We don't even have hypotheses. Okay, that's my claim. Okay, now why it is difficult? It's difficult because those structures share something in common, which hard to imagine how neural population will represent them. First of all, each one of them, a temporal sequence or cognitive map, is a collection of items, collection of objects, a location in space, and so on and so forth. And particularly, they come with specific size in the sense that this set of things like object location associations, sometimes there are fewer objects, sometimes more objects, longer sequences, longer episodic memory, and so on and so forth. So they come with flexible size. There is no kind of a fixed vector. Apparently, it's hard to see how it will represent it. Furthermore, what's important is the relation between those. So how neurons or neural circuits represent relations. You can say, well, there are synapses. Turns out synapses enable representations, but they unlikely to actually be the ones that represent, that you can decode directly relations. So neurons have to do it. How neurons encode relations? Furthermore, there's recursive, generative, compositional, hierarchical structures, and so on. So that's one. So how those structures might be represented by neurons. And the second question is the task. So that's also what differentiates it. It's not only you want to memorize one episodic memory or to discriminate between one episodic memory or another, or to retrieve an episodic memory. We want to reason about it. We want to unpack them. Let's say I recall a memory, episodic memory. I want to be able to ask, okay, what this person do at that time, and so on and so forth. So in computational sense, we take queries. We want to query this. So it's a different computation than until now. We had the recognition, discrimination, memory retrieval. This is a richer task, or set of tasks. All right, so there have been a history of models about that. Basically what I'm going to describe to you is a generalization of what's called vector symbolic architectures. There are called semantic pointer theory, holographic representations, and cognitive scientists have been studying this question and proposed models of those. But like in other areas in neuroscience, they were all kind of very small toy models which they demonstrated this, and nobody, I think, or almost everybody believed that this doesn't have enough capacity to kind of scale up to real problems like real language and real situations of rich cognitive environments or episodic memory and so on. But again, deep networks, more recently, have been using generalization of those concepts, and they showed promising results on kind of perceptual language combination of tasks and so on and so forth. So it's worth thinking about it more seriously. So here is an example of the question about, suppose I want to store in memory, working memory or long-term memory, a temporal sequence of events, okay? So even working memory, it is a persistent activity or maybe sequence of neural activity, but typically working memory is a persistent activity of a static thing. There is some stimulus and it reverberates in my working memory. I'm asking something else. How a working memory represents a sequence of states in outside world. Something like what Yuval, if he's here, asked basically, okay? So here are two possibilities. One possibility, which is suggested by many, including Cantor and Sompolinsky many years ago, that a temporal sequence is encoded as a temporal sequence in the neural states. Okay, so it's one temporal sequence, another temporal sequence, and so on and so forth. Now, for variety of reasons, this is not good enough. For instance, if the network is in a particular state in the sequence, you cannot interrogate it and ask again, what happens before, what happens after, or what will happen after? Can you make a prediction? No, I am now in a state, in the present. So what we actually are looking for, and more importantly, it's hard to generalize this to other structure, like associations, not between events and time, but between, let's say, locations or events and space, or association between events or between things that are in other parts of memory, and so on and so forth. So time is linear, and the semantic structures are richer and multidimensional, just at a linear sequence. So it was very hard over many years for many attempts to actually extend this to beyond temporal sequences. So basically the idea is we want to do something else. We want to take the entire episodic memory or the entire sequence and encode it in one vector, population vector, and store this vector as a fixed point in a memory state. So that's basically, I would say, the conundrum between a flow model of time and a block universe, but now not in philosophical, phenomenological terms, but in a concrete question about how the brain might or actually represent time in this case. But language is the same, sentence or episodic memory or other structures. Is there a way to bind all elements of episodic structure or temporal sequence or whatever into one state and take this state as a holistic unity and encode it in working memory, in long-term memory, and interrogate it, and so on and so forth? So, okay, good. So the answer is yes. I'll just give you kind of the idea. The idea is that let's suppose you have just a set of binary relations like location and object. So imagine that you have a network that take instances of object and location, or a word and its role in a sentence, and so on. So a sequence of those encoded into a network. Then the idea is that there is a nonlinear bonding of each one of these pairs by G. And then there is a summation of all these elements that comprises the sequence or the memory and so on, the structure. So there is kind of summation or integration by working memory. And then you have a vector, and everything now is a fixed length. It doesn't matter how many of those you put into the network. Because of the summation operation, you basically don't expand the representation. You have a fixed size representation which represent information about all the elements and the binding between them. So that's something that turned out to be workable. There's one thing which is important, and I just say that this model, this representation is compressive, is lossy. You lose information because the binding, if you fix the representation size, you lose information by the binding, you lose information by the summation. So it's important consequence of this model is that you need something else, that once you do that and you interrogate these structures, you need a dictionary. So imagine cortex has stored all the elements that we're talking about, has stored object, has stored locations, and so on. So this dictionary is long-term memory in object, and this network is encoding and enabled retrieving of the structure that composed of graph relation of this state. So in deep networks, there is a lot of research about them. We have done research about associative memory structures. Can you take such structures, bind them in the way I described, and store them as fixed points and then retrieve them? And the answer is yes. And that's basically what I want to say as a discussion. And I think this last point is important because there aren't many other alternatives to, in my view, to a realistic or a plausible model of how structures are encoded in the brain in a flexible way that allows them encoding, decoding in working memory and long-term memory and reason about them. We still don't know if this is scalable to real-life problems. We still have many questions about mechanisms in the brain and where in the brain. But I think this is an important point that we as computational cognitive neuroscientists have to pay attention to. Thanks.
So we have time for a couple of questions. Marius?
Yeah, so those networks, the deep networks, I understand feed-forward networks. And they can do all those classifications and, as you suggest, even more complex things. But we know the brain is recurrent, so can you comment on whether you think there would be things that that recurrency might make a difference to what those feed-forward networks can do?
Sure. So this is an important question, and the short answer is that what this deep network tell us, not as engineers, but as computer scientists, but as brain theorists, is the feasibility, is the proof of concept that feed-forward architecture is sufficient for this type of kind of simple, maybe relative, now we can say simple object recognition task. But cognition in general is much more complex. There is time aspect to it, and there are priors, there are beliefs, there are memories that should be incorporated, and ambiguity. So I wouldn't say this is just a minimal model of kind of invariant recognition task. And furthermore, in the second part of what I talked about, for instance, storing in long-term or in working memory, storing structure, there you definitely, even this model relies on recurrency.
I have a question, actually goes back, the second time we can evoke Richard Simon here, in the context of connecting of episodic memories, whether in working memory or in general, and the idea that memories both need to be separate, but also you need to be able to connect them and integrate them when they're overlapping elements. And I was wondering if you could comment on, is that what you mean by integration here, and how this relates?
So this is again a primitive form of integration, because if I go back to what actually we're doing up there is taking elements of memory, or associations, here a pairwise association, and first of all encode the binding of them by some nonlinear operation, and secondly summing them into one vector which basically integrate them.
Across separate events, yes?
Across separate events, separate associations. So there is a temporal integration of a stream of associations into one. Now, of course, you can say, well, what about the next level? Maybe those episodic memories are themselves higher structure, but you can see once you have this principle, the problem with hierarchies and compositionality is that previous models always required expansion of the dimension. Then there is not enough neurons in the brain. This is a lossy operation, but the advantage of that it has a fixed size. So there is some capacity, of course, but I think there is a high capacity of storing complex structures and relation between those structures in such a system.
Hi.
Last question, Ron, can you put on your presentation?
Here. Okay, so I'm still not sure. Is this like a framework you're suggesting, or do you have experimental predictions that you can?
That's very good.
share?
So I think the first part of my talk, there is enough empirical evidence, although sporadic, when I talk about neural responses, but from, let's say, from the visual stream, that something like that manifold changes are part of the story. So I think that part has a good empirical grounding. The second part is much more speculative, I agree. And as I said, we need more speculations. We need more models or suggestions of possibilities. And to me, this is currently the only one that is really on the table. However, I must say there are some concrete predictions. For instance, one prediction is that when animals retrieve, or humans retrieve, temporal sequence from memory, in the retrieval process, there will be a temporal sequence, in some sense, in the brain, some replay, if you want, of the sequence, but there will also be a population of neurons that will be persistent, will just represent, in this model, will just represent the retrieval of the entire structure. And so that's one concrete prediction, testable prediction from this model.
Thank you very much.